Maddy, tell me how You're in Good Company got started.
Yeah, so going probably back to around September, October last year, I think. The Equity Mates team who produce our podcast were actually the two guys that run the Equity Mates podcast, Bryce and Alec. We're taking their podcast full time and Equity Mates full time and leaving their jobs. So they posted on their Facebook group saying, if you want to get involved, if you want to join the team, get in touch. So I did that, not really expecting too much, to be honest. I think it was a little bit of like lockdown boredom and wanting to do something that was, a little bit extracurricular from my day job. So I got in touch thinking maybe that I could get paid to help them research the podcast, thinking getting paid to read the AFR, that's ideal. So when we got in touch, we started chatting about, whether I invest and whether my friends invest. And we just got onto this massive conversation. It was we got to the point where it was like, we feel like we really need a podcast that I guess is run by women, a little bit more targeted towards women, that can really try and make this conversation more accessible and help people learn about the benefits of investing in a really like accessible and safe way. And then they're like, cool, so do you want to host it? And I was like, so I called Sophie and I was like, and I think we were on the phone for like probably 45 minutes before I brought it up, just chatting. And then eventually I was like, so I've got this idea. And luckily she said yes.
What do you both do for work outside of the podcast as well?
Yeah, so we both, I'll let Maddy speak for herself, but we do both work in finance. We did commerce degrees at uni, also arts, but we didn't do anything towards like investing. Finance is really broad and investing is kind of just one section of it all. But I work in M&A. So really like most days I'm looking at different types of businesses in a lot of different industries, often people wanting to sell their business. So it really complements well what we're doing with the podcast, because I guess you're looking at the internals of like how companies run and who's running them and their intentions. So I really love the job that I'm doing at the minute in M&A. And yeah, I guess that and the podcast take up pretty much 90% of our time.
I would love to add something different to that, but Sophie and I pretty much have the same job at different firms. So she just described my job perfectly too.
And how did you two already know each other?
We went to school together. So we met all the way back in year 7.
Wow.
There are some photos you don't want to see of us when we're in year 7, like posing with our scooters, like so bad, not good.
Oh, I'm getting flashbacks.
I love that. That's so nice. So what has the biggest milestone been for you both with the podcast so far? And have you had any moments that were kind of pinch me moments?
Because we're still growing. Honestly, like every tiny thing feels like a milestone moment. Like every small achievement honestly feels like a milestone moment. Like we'll get an extra 10 followers on Instagram or an extra 100 listeners on our podcast platform. And they like still feel like huge milestones. But I think one of the best things about doing this podcast is really the people that we get to meet and interview through some of the networks that we've created. We have people on like the CEO of Adore Beauty, which is just insane
Amazing.
for us, because when we first started thinking about this podcast, one of the things, in October last year, one of the things we were talking about was like, oh, we could speak about the Adore Beauty IPO, because that happened in October 2020. Sorry, when I say IPO, just meaning the company was going public, from private to public. And then, last week or the week before, we had the Adore Beauty CEO on. So it came, real full circle. So I think it's all the little moments, and just for me personally, all the guests that we get to speak to, because they have such incredible insights and so much experience. And sometimes I can't believe they've said yes to wanting to talk to us.
I know. I think that like every single interview, I'm like, why? How did we get here?
That imposter syndrome.
I know. I would completely echo everything Soph said. And I think the only thing I would add to that is we've started a segment on the podcast called Show Me the Money, Honey. And it's where we get a little voice snippet from community members where they basically just say roughly how much they're earning each month, how much they're putting into the stock market and what they're investing in. And it's all sort of just to try and make the topic a bit less secret and like open the doors a little bit so we can kind of see inside what people are actually doing. But it's making me so proud because so many people are sending in voice memos and they've just started investing, and it was sort of like, you know, inspired or influenced by the podcast. And I just think, you know, obviously Sophie and I would really love to grow this podcast to be as big as we can, but I think, you know, every time we do this, I try and just remind myself that even if one person starts investing because of it, then it's like job worthwhile. Because at the end of the day, we just really like, we have seen and experienced the benefits of investing firsthand. And if we can help one other person to do that, then that's goal achieved.
People who are listening to the podcast that don't really know much about that stuff, what advice would you give them?
Not
Would you
financial
say
advice?
Yeah, not financial advice.
What tip?
How long do you think you spend on the podcast each week in comparison to obviously you both work full-time as well?
We actually made a new rule for this season. Season 1, we didn't have this rule. Season 2, we've now got it. We can't text each other during the day because it's too distracting. So, you know, from our normal jobs is what, you know, 8:30 till 6 or much later sometimes.
Whenever you finish, yeah.
Yeah. And then it's always pre-morning, you know, up at 6 a.m. texting each other, and late at night. I think we'd spend quite a few hours, but as I say to everyone, it doesn't feel like work. Like we love doing it so much that it doesn't matter if it's 11 p.m. at night or 6 a.m. in the morning. I'm ready to do anything.
If people want, I know you've sort of mentioned those platforms, but if people do want to connect with the You're in Good Company podcast or some of your conversation groups, how do they find you?
Yeah, so we are on Instagram at YIGC podcast or on Facebook. The link is in our bio because it's a bit of a long name to find, but it's YIGC Investing Podcast Discussion Group.
So if anyone's got debt,
yeah,
try and pay that off so that you're in a comfortable, you know, surplus situation to start investing. That's probably point number 1.
Yeah.
But I think Maddie actually just put up a really good video on our Instagram about 60 that started. But I think the first one for me is really like exactly what you said. Like there's a bit of FOMO that happens with investing sometimes when you do hear people investing and getting gains. But the first thing is that you just need to be comfortable with where you're at with your cash situation. Make sure you have a little bit stored away and make sure you're comfortable, you know, to put whatever you're putting into the stock market, you know, you're not going to be touching it for a while. And then from there, it's really for me about, you know, doing your own research, not listening to other people's stock tips, you know, finding companies that you like and you use and that you enjoy, and just putting a little bit in, you know, even if it's, I mean, some brokerage platforms are literally like you can just put in $100 these days.
Exactly.
And I think once you have your money in there, you just become very engaged because you're like, oh, that's my money. I want to see what's happening to it. And I think that really gets you started on your own investing journey. It's just putting that bit of money in.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to start is just start. I know when I was beginning, I really put it off for a long time because I was worried about perfection and finding the perfect broker and finding the perfect stock. And then what I realized once I got started was, number 1, I keep changing my broker, so it didn't even matter. But number 2, as soon as I actually had some money in there, it was so much easier because I could learn by doing instead of learn by trying to read all like the complicated stuff online where you go down a rabbit hole and get complete analysis paralysis. So yeah, like don't worry about it being perfect. And I think, you know, every investor makes mistakes. And I think it's probably safe to say that we learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes. There's nothing like when you're becoming a bit too good of an investor and everything's going really well. You think you're amazing and then something happens and you're like, oh, no, definitely not a pro. But yeah, I would really just say get started and, join. It doesn't have to be our community, but would love for you to join our community. But, find a group of friends or a community where you feel like you can go to ask questions or talk to people about your experiences, because Sophie and I talk about this a lot, but we both had people sort of on the journey with us when we're starting out. And I think it made all the difference, because you're not going at it alone and you have someone to talk to about what you're going through, and it really, really helps.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think, well, this was what I was going to ask next. So what do you think the biggest difference between, I suppose, investing in something traditional, like, for example, having Woolworths shares on the ANZ investing app, or, or going to a financial advisor, getting them to invest in some, more traditional Australian shares, to now things like the crypto, obviously, market. You can use things like Binance, or, as I mentioned, I've got the ease of access of being able to invest in part shares in the US on other apps. So I was just going to ask, like, what do you think the biggest difference is? It's probably a really big question, but these days there's so many different things. Like, what do you think the difference is in a short summary for people that just have no idea?
So the way, when I was looking at this question, I was like, this is so hard to answer, but I think the best way to maybe summarize it is to think of them as separate asset classes. So when you are thinking about, your stocks, so either your Australian stocks, like your banks that you were saying, or your US stocks, you're talking about Shopify, like they're your equities, they're companies, and you're buying a piece of those companies. Whereas I would consider something like crypto as a digital asset. So it's a completely different asset class. And I think that's why when investors talk about it, it's like you're adding both stocks and digital assets to your portfolio. And that's what's like creating the diversity. I think a lot of the cryptocurrencies, especially like the Bitcoin and the Ethereum, have incredible use cases. A lot of their value these days is carried by people's perception of like how valuable they are. But they do have use cases. But the difference really is that you're not buying into a company per se and where that company is going and growing. You're buying into a use case of a technology or a transaction or a purpose. In summary, I think the best way to really think about it is that like completely two different asset classes. You've got equities, stocks, and your digital assets. And I think digital assets, it's really hard to get your head around right now, but like it might be, as big or bigger than stocks in the future as we all just move towards the internet.
Definitely. Would you say that, one is better when you're not better, but would you say that one's more accessible and easy to understand for first-time investors than maybe another? Like, would you recommend someone coming in with nothing and just kind of learning about all the different things, or is it maybe better or like more efficient, I suppose, or to sort of start somewhere basic?
I mean, from personal view, I would say that starting at somewhere like stocks and equities is probably a little less volatile in terms of if you're putting your money in, that there's less volatility in it. But on the other hand, when I speak to the younger generation, like I have a younger sister and all her younger friends, they like know everything about cryptocurrencies and nothing about stocks.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
That's my brother as well.
Behind.
Yeah. And they're all about the NFTs. They're all about those quick gains. I mean, they're also very young, so I'm sure their risk tolerance is a lot higher.